Whether you agree or disagree with the resurgence of classic survival horror games getting remakes, the fact is that they've been highly successful in most cases in terms of profits, and we'll probably see developers continue to crank them out, which in my opinion is a good thing, especially with the quality of the remakes that we've been getting lately. And yes, I know there's a whole debate between fans right now regarding our favorite classic games getting remakes, but honestly, I'm all for seeing some of our favorite games get reimagined if it's done the right way. So, on today's episode of Nerdspace Games, I'll be taking a look at all of the horror game remakes that we've gotten over the past few decades as I give you guys my personal favorites. These remakes were handled in the right way by reimagining our favorite classic horror games while also remaining faithful to the source material. Before we get started though, know that I won't be including remasters. I know there's a thin line between remake and remasters nowadays, but for the most part I'll be using my own personal judgment in terms of what I consider a remake or a remaster. Also, I'm sure you could tell by looking at the thumbnail, but Silent Hill 2 Remake will be featured at some point on this list. However, I will be avoiding spoilers for this game, so you don't have to worry about any spoilers relating to Silent Hill 2. With that being said, I would avoid the comments section of today's video if you are trying to avoid spoilers. But if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is the top 10 best horror game remakes of all time. Let's get it. Number 10, The Last of Us Part 1. The Last of Us is without a doubt one of the best horror games ever created. The story, the character development, the unique monster designs, I could go on and on about how great this game is, and it may very well be one of the most cinematic and best story-based horror games of all time. Before I continue on with this entry though, it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of controversy surrounding the fact that this game got a remake. See, The Last of Us is probably the poster child of a game that clearly did not need a remake. Yet Naughty Dog and Sony saw the insane amount of money they made each time they remastered this incredible game. Which they did, like 3 or 4 times since its initial release in 2013? But the argument regarding if the game needed a remake shouldn't really be something that takes off points for a list like this. Instead, let's focus on the remake itself and if it surpassed the original, which it definitely did. The Last of Us Part 1 is without a doubt the definitive way to experience the game. The gameplay mechanics have included features that were introduced in the sequel, which made the gameplay much superior to the original version. The visuals, which were already extremely impressive on the original PlayStation 3, and every remaster that came after took another big step forward. And there were even bonus modes and new ways to experience the game altogether. With all of that being said, The Last of Us Part 1 feels more like a glorified remastered. To be honest, if you told me it was a remaster from the start, I would believe you. Yet with the new features and major step up in visuals, the game is just barely able to be considered a remake in my eyes. However, since The Last of Us Part 1 failed to add as much as other entries that you'll see on this list later on, and the fact that the PC port came out in a horrible state, this remake, despite being the definitive way to experience the story for the first time, lacks anything major that you would expect from a modern remake nowadays. Perhaps that's due to the fact that this remake literally came out 9 years after the original. Like, why Naughty Dog? Number 9, Corpse Party 2021. Created from a small indie development team, the original Corpse Party took the world by storm with its simple yet terrifying approach to the horror genre. While the themes and the story of Corpse Party was viewed as highly disturbing, it definitely hit the mark in terms of the atmospheric horror environments that you would want from any setting in a horror game. However, the definitive way to experience the original story of Corpse Party is without a doubt the 2021 remake of the game. This version of Corpse Party not only changed parts of the story and added different endings, but it also enhanced the game itself in multiple ways. The voice acting was much better, Seiko's voice acting and Naomi's voice acting being some of my favorites in the remake. The inclusion of CG scenes added a more immersive experience which was lacking in the original game. The artwork of the remake is far superior in just about every single way. And the remake also included additional side chapters that added additional background on some other characters of the game. Overall, Corpse Party 2021 is a fantastic remake, and it's well deserving of a spot on this list for the mere reason that it's actually a better experience than the original game. Number 8, Alone in the Dark. I gave a lot of heat towards Alone in the Dark when it first released earlier this year, but honestly, it wasn't a bad game. It was just a very mid-level game for me. However, there were a lot of things that this game did that really impressed me. For one, the atmosphere of the game was spot on, especially when exploring Deserto Manor, the main setting of Alone in the Dark that sort of acted as the hub world of the game. The cast was excellent, with the likes of David Harbour and Jodie Comer leading the pack. And the story kept me intrigued with unique side characters, diverse locations, and terrifying enemy types around every corner. Considering the state of what the original game was based on, the remake surpassed the original in most ways. With all of this said though, the remake suffered from some issues that prevented it from being a top tier remake. The gameplay was clunky despite it being a modern survival horror game. It was also really short despite having 2 scenarios, but unfortunately each character's story was basically the exact same with minor changes. This wouldn't have been that big of an issue though, as we've seen other survival horror games do this, like the 2002 remake of Resident Evil, but considering this game lacked in other departments, having 2 unique campaigns may have added some brownie points to this remake. Overall, while the game improved on the original in a lot of ways, it unfortunately didn't stand out enough to earn a higher spot on today's list, but the interesting story and the phenomenal cast alone are enough reasons to at least give this game a shot, as it's still a fun game for fans of the survival horror genre. Number 7, Project Zero 2 Wii Edition. Project Zero 2 Wii Edition is another game that rests on the fence between remake and remaster. If you don't recognize the name, that's because the US version that released on PlayStation 2 in 2003 was called Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly. And if you are a big fan of survival horror, that name I'm sure you recognize. On paper, this entry is basically a re-release of Fatal Frame 2 on the Nintendo Wii. Yet there are elements to this version of the game that basically make it feel like a completely different experience. For one, the visuals of the Wii edition of this game were far superior to that of the PlayStation 2, which is to be expected considering that this version of the game was released 9 years after the original on a newer console. Yet the visuals were probably the least exciting change in this remake. The first major change comes from the fact that this version of the game was made with the Wii motion controls in mind. In fact, there is an argument that could be made that Project Zero 2 may have very well been one of the best horror games that best utilized the motion controls of the Wii. Because of the main combat of the Fatal Frame series focusing on taking pictures of ghosts, the motion controls of the Wii were perfect for this type of game. On top of the upgraded visuals and the use of motion controls, the Wii edition also introduced the modern over-the-shoulder perspective compared to the fixed camera perspective that the original game had. And as someone who normally enjoys fixed camera survival horror games, a game like Fatal Frame 2 that requires the player to switch to first person to take pictures of ghosts, this change was definitely a positive one in my opinion. The one negative thing I have to say about this remake comes from the fact that it never officially released in the US despite it being a much better experience than the original game. So a lot of us Americans never truly got to play the best version of one of the best survival horror game sequels of all time. Number 6, System Shock. Released almost 30 years prior to the remake, System Shock is easily one of the best sci-fi horror games ever created. It pretty much provided the inspiration for games like Dead Space and Alien Isolation, and it also introduced one of the most iconic villains ever seen in a video game, Shodan. Yet because of the game originally only being available on PC, there were a lot of people that missed out on playing this classic sci-fi horror game. However, in 2023, Night Dive Studios took on the difficult task of remaking a beloved classic horror game and turning it into one of the best horror game remakes of all time. System Shock 2023 is without a doubt the best way to play this game, and this time it would be available on PlayStation and Xbox as well. This remake has everything you could possibly want from a remake. The improved visuals help this game create a more intense atmosphere, allowing it to live up to its full potential in terms of the scare factor and the terrifying environment of Citadel Station. Expanded levels and maps that were far easier to navigate than the original game. And the changes made to the player's movements and limited inventory space added a different experience that was much more enjoyable than the original game. Sure, there were some details of the remake that we wish were changed, mainly in terms of the gameplay mechanics. But overall, Night Dive proved that they had what it takes to remake a classic survival horror game, and now I'm really hyped about the fact that they will be in charge of remastering another classic sci-fi horror game, The Thing. Number 5, Resident Evil 4 2023. It took getting through half of this list before we finally came across our first Resident Evil remake in the form of the franchise's most recent remake, Resident Evil 4. Before talking about this game, I'm sure some of you will be pretty disappointed with Resident Evil 4 Remake claiming the number 5 spot, but honestly, the top 5 on my list today are all pretty interchangeable, and I feel like it comes down to preference in terms of which one you might think is better. Each entry from this point on are both faithful to the source material while adding things that prove each game in big ways. Anyway, similar to the debate on The Last of Us Part 1, fans were somewhat annoyed when Capcom first announced that they would be remaking Resident Evil 4. The main reason being that a lot of the core fanbase believed that there were other mainline games that deserved the remake treatment more, myself included on that side of the debate. With that being said, Resident Evil 4 Remake surpassed all expectations, and it actually did a lot more than most of us were expecting. Unlike The Last of Us Part 1, Resident Evil 4 Remake took the entire original game and reimagined it completely. Starting off with the mechanics of the remake, I don't think there's ever been a Resident Evil game that had better gameplay than Resident Evil 4 Remake. Unlike the original RE4, the player now had full control over Leon's movements while aiming. The QTEs were toned down drastically and were limited to evading certain attacks from enemies. However, my personal favorite change in gameplay mechanics came from the knife play of the game. Leon could now perform stealth kills, parry attacks, and counter grapples with his knife skills. It added a new layer of gameplay that ultimately made the player feel more like a badass, like Leon. Add these elements to the obvious improvements in visuals thanks to the RE engine, better atmospheric core, which is more noticeable at the start of the game and in the Regenerator lab, and the changes made to certain characters like Luis and Ashley, which gave them more backstory and increased their likability. And you have one hell of a remake that some people would argue is the best horror game remake of all time. Number 4, Dead Space. I feel like if there was any game that came out last year that didn't get enough love, it was Dead Space Remake. This game was a masterpiece, and it's one of the best examples of a remake being done the right way. However, due to other big blockbuster horror games releasing last year, like Resident Evil 4 and Alan Wake 2, Dead Space was kind of forgotten, and it didn't even get nominated for Game of the Year, which is honestly a damn tragedy. Anyway, the original game was already one of the scariest and best sci-fi horror games of all time. However, the remake took what made the original Dead Space a masterpiece and improved it in ways that we couldn't even imagine until we saw the remake for ourselves. First off, Isaac Clarke now had voice lines, which created a more immersive experience for the player and allowed us to see more emotional moments between Isaac and the rest of the characters in this game. I didn't realize how important this change was until I experienced this firsthand for myself. Probably one of the more obvious changes came from the visuals. Yeah, it's a lot more complex than saying that the game looks better. That's because the new look at the Nostromo with updated graphics created a much more intense atmosphere that, in my opinion, may be one of the best atmospheric horror settings that I've ever experienced in a horror game. The inclusion of side quests and files that helped explain the lore of the game in much more detail added more replayability and motivated the player to explore more than they did in the original game. Especially since new weapons were found, not purchased, and resources were much more limited, and it felt more like a survival horror game than the original did. The zero gravity sections in the original game were absolutely hated by the players. However, in the remake, these areas were improved drastically, making it a much smoother and enjoyable experience. And the sound designs of Dead Space Remake added a new layer of fear that created tense moments every sound you heard when exploring the Nostromo. However, my personal favorite change in the remake came from a new feature called Dynamic Events. This was a new mechanic included in the remake that allowed the game to feel new and different every time you played through it. Instead of monsters popping up at the same location every time, random events will occur throughout each playthrough, which would always keep the players on their toes as they never knew what to expect each time they entered a room, no matter how many times they played the game. While I personally enjoyed playing Resident Evil 4 more than I did Dead Space 2023, I think from looking at both games as a remake and comparing what they improved on compared to the original, Dead Space 2023 is definitely a better remake in my opinion, just not a better game. So for that reason, I put Dead Space slightly above Resident Evil 4, but honestly, I could totally understand the argument for Resident Evil 4 being higher than it on your own personal list. In fact, after watching this video, be sure to let me know what your top 5 or top 10 horror game remakes are in the comments below. Number 3, Resident Evil 2. Jumping back over to Resident Evil, RE2 Remake is without a doubt the most anticipated horror game remake of all time. I mean straight up, ever since the 2002 remake of Resident Evil, fans have been begging Capcom to give the same treatment to Resident Evil 2. And it took years before Capcom finally listened and gave us Resident Evil 2 Remake in 2019. Now, the original game was already a classic, and it's actually my favorite video game of all time. I still play the shit out of that game on multiple consoles, PC, PlayStation, and even my Nintendo 64. So, getting a remake of my favorite game of all time was a massive deal to me, and I was both scared and excited for it. Thankfully, I was very satisfied with the result. First off, thanks to the RE engine that was created for Resident Evil 7, the RPD station has never looked better. The remake took an already eerie setting and made every room of this iconic building more intense and scarier. The details on the walls of the RPD station, the constant beating on the windows of the RPD station, and the creature designs added with the gore and lost limb effects created some truly intense moments. There were also some changes that were definitely welcomed by most fans. The addition of the Raccoon City Orphanage was a nice touch, and characters like Robert Kendo and Marvin Brana were way more likable than their original counterparts. Improved boss fights, more character development, new and exciting puzzles to solve, and much more made our time in the RPD station and the remake a fantastic one. However, one of my favorite changes in the remake is Mr. X. While he was only involved in Scenario B of the original game, this time Mr. X appeared in both playthroughs of the game and he was much more threatening. In the remake, he moved faster and he had a constant presence throughout the RPD station instead of appearing at scripted moments like he did in the original game. In fact, after he enters the scene, you could actually hear him walking around the RPD station as you get closer to him. It's honestly impressive with how involved he was as a stalker enemy in the remake, and in my opinion, he even surpasses OG Nemesis. Of course, that theme song he had was iconic and fire as hell though. Now, I will say that the remake isn't perfect, and honestly, I feel like my love for the original game may make me a bit biased in ranking it over games like Dead Space Remake and Resident Evil 4 Remake due to some of the negative changes that this game has. For one, the modern soundtrack isn't as good as the originals. It's still a pretty solid soundtrack, but it definitely doesn't compare to the original game. Also, the removal of the Scenario A and B system along with the zapping system was a big L for me. More so the A-B scenario system, as that actually added a lot of replayability to the original game. Sure, you have first run and second run for the remake, but in the original game you were motivated to play through the game 4 times instead of twice, whereas there's no reason for you to play through the remake after the second run. Outside of those 2 minor issues though, Resident Evil 2 Remake is a fantastic remake, and it's my 3rd favorite game of the franchise outside of the original RE2, and one other remake which we'll talk about right now. Number 2, Resident Evil. The 2002 remake of Resident Evil is the best Resident Evil remake. I stand by that, and I'm planting my flag on that hill. In fact, outside of one very minor detail, the 2002 remake of Resident Evil only improved on the original game by adding new areas, new monsters, and improving on almost every aspect of the original game. Diving into the visuals, even 22 years later, these graphics still hold up. It's actually really impressive with what Capcom accomplished with the 2002 remake of Resident Evil visually on the Nintendo GameCube. And the remasters of this game only improved on that drastically over the years. Also, the sound design is top notch here, and honestly, it's probably better than most modern survival horror games. From the ticking of the grandfather clock in the dining room, to hearing the sound of dogs and crows in the distance when outside, to my personal favorite sound, a crimson head rising. Every little sound you hear in this game adds to the overall immersion of the Spencer Mansion, and the sound design of this game helps create one of the best atmospheric horror settings in a video game. Speaking of the Crimson Heads, the 2002 remake of Resident Evil added a lot of new things to this game. Firstly, you have some new monsters to worry about, including the infamous Crimson Heads that I just talked about. These guys will literally make your heart drop as you're exploring the Spencer Mansion when all of a sudden one of them rises from the dead. The Crimson Heads move faster, hit harder, and can endure more damage, and they are easily one of the toughest monsters to put down. Hell, I would argue that they are even more difficult to put down than the Hunters. Another new monster is Lisa Trevor. While she's not as intimidating as other stalker enemies, and she definitely doesn't scare us as much as the Crimson Heads, she does add more disturbing lore to the backstory of Umbrella while also introducing a somewhat small stalker-like enemy to the game. Albeit not to the standard of Mr. X or Nemesis, of course. New areas were also introduced in the remake of Resident Evil, which also added a new experience for veteran players of the franchise. On top of areas and monsters, new gameplay mechanics were introduced in the form of counter weapons. Now, Chris and Jill could find daggers, grenades, and tasers and use them to counter grapple attacks from zombies and other creatures in the game. Add in the intense new soundtrack, additional lore, and more involvement from characters like Richard and Rebecca, and you have one of the best survival horror remakes of all time. In fact, I would say it was the best horror game remake of all time until very recently, and honestly, I know I'm about to get a lot of hate for this next entry, but fuck it, let's do it. Number 1, Silent Hill 2. Call it recency bias, but if you were to ask me right this second what my favorite horror video game remake is, I would tell you Silent Hill 2. Now straight up, I'm hesitant to give this answer because I haven't spent a lot of time with this game yet. Resident Evil Remake I've been replaying for 2 decades now, and I've had at least a year to appreciate RE4 and Dead Space, so there's a distinct possibility that my opinion on Silent Hill 2 Remake could change in a year from now. But looking at everything that Bloober Team accomplished with this game against all of the odds is just mind-blowing. In fact, this game is my game of the year at the moment. First, there are 2 very important things to consider when remaking a big classic survival horror game like Silent Hill 2. 1, be faithful to the source material. You fuck this up, then fans will turn against you immediately. Look at Resident Evil 3 Remake. Cut areas, cut boss fights, and the lack of intimidation from Nemesis really piss off the fans. But this also brings me to the second most important thing when remaking a game like Silent Hill 2. Bring new things to the table that will keep things fresh for veterans and improve the game to the point where it warrants a remake instead of a remaster. Finding the perfect balance between these two things is difficult but vital for creating a great remake. And I believe Silent Hill 2 mastered this better than any other horror remake that I've ever played. I'll skip over the visuals because clearly it's going to be better looking, and it definitely is. Instead, let's first take a look at the gameplay, as that's one of the biggest differences. Silent Hill 2 Remake takes inspiration from other modern survival horror games like Resident Evil 2 and Alan Wake 2 and adds their own unique approach to this style. Is it as smooth as RE2 or RE4? Definitely not. But it does include melee combat and adds in a dodge mechanic that allows the combat of Silent Hill 2 to feel unique and immersive compared to other survival horror games without it leaning too much into the action genre. Speaking of horror, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but Silent Hill 2 Remake honestly surpasses the original in terms of the atmosphere. This is not an easy task because up until this point, I would argue that the original Silent Hill 2 had one of, if not the best atmosphere in a horror game. My favorite moments in this remake was the transition from the fog world to the nightmare reality. See, Silent Hill has always explored the transition between two separate realities. However, Silent Hill 2 was always a more subtle change between the realities. In the remake, however, it's a much bigger and more distinct change to the point where it drastically changes up the setting during each transformation. My favorite example of this is going from Woodside Apartments to Blue Creek Apartments. Speaking of improvements, the enemies in Silent Hill 2 Remake are much more terrifying. One of the best improvements are the mannequins. Holy fuck, they are absolutely terrifying. While they've always had a creepy design, the remake implements this new mechanic to them in which they hid in random places and wait for the player to either shine their light on them or approach them. This mechanic made the mannequins more terrifying than the bubblehead nurses, honestly. Character development for each of the side characters and the overall story of the game remained mostly untouched, all the way down to most of the endings. However, Silent Hill 2 Remake added alternate endings that were not available in the original game while also expanding the game drastically. I mean, I've always wanted to explore some of the buildings and stores along the streets of Silent Hill, and you can now finally do this in the remake. Plus, each area feels twice as long, and it took me roughly around 16 hours to beat, which by the way is roughly twice as long as the original game. Overall, Bloober Team did the impossible with Silent Hill 2. It took a classic that was beloved by fans all around the world, made the right improvements, and stayed as loyal as possible to the source material and delivered the best horror game remake of all time in my eyes. Straight up, if Konami handed Bloober Team the keys to the Silent Hill franchise, then I would be all in for remakes of other games within this series. I want more, I really do. Come on Konami, give Bloober Team Silent Hill 1 now, please do that. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Do you agree that Silent Hill 2 Remake is the best horror game remake of all time, or is recency bias getting to me and something else deserves that title? Let me know down below. Also, for those of you that played Silent Hill 2 Remake, let me know what you guys thought about it. I loved it, especially on PlayStation 5. Be sure to drop your opinions of the game in the comments down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.